panel, stories that prove less is more. At this panel, we're going to talk about stories, not necessarily just stories in fiction length, but just stories of extreme brevity. We're going to try to discuss whether these stories are considered actual stories and whether they hold substance, focusing on questions: do works of this length help or hinder writers? Can these stories have just as much impact as stories of traditional length? And, on and on. So, with me today, by the way, I'm Robert Swartwood, the editor of Hit Fiction. And with me today is Martone, whose new book is will be Fourth Reporter. So, Michael. Then there's Roxane Gay. Roxane is the co-editor of Pank. Her writing appears or is forthcoming in Mid-American Review, McSweeney's Online, Gargoyle, Olivas, and others. She teaches at Eastern Illinois University. Randall Brown directs and teaches at the Rosemont College MFA in Creative Writing Program. He is the author of the award-winning collection, Not to Live, which is coming back into print.
Yes, from PS Press in Philadelphia.
From PS Press in Philadelphia. Do you know when? Soon. Okay. Spring. Spring. Okay. And he's published widely in both online and print, and he manages the blog flashfiction.net. And then Daniel Olivas is the author of 6 books, including the forthcoming novel, The Book of Want. He is the editor of the anthology Latinos in Lotus Land. His work has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the El Paso Times, and several anthologies. To give a brief background on, I guess mostly the book, or in hint fiction in general. What is hint fiction? By definition, hint fiction is kind of a story of 25 words or fewer that suggests larger, more complex story. It's inspired by the Hemingway story. For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn. Smith Magazine has kind of created their own little niche with the 6-word memoirs. And I've always been impressed with the 6-word story, with Hemingway's story, but I've always wondered, like, what about like 10-word stories or 12-word stories? I mean, everybody likes to give a label to things. There's flash fiction, sudden fiction, microfiction, there's drabbles, dribbles, but what do you call a 13-word story? If we have to call it something. I mean, personally, I think, a story is a story, regardless of its length, but, I don't know, everyone they just like to label things. So, about 2 years ago, I wrote this essay, which was hint fiction, when flash fiction becomes too flashy. It was a very sardonic look on just, everybody's supposed shrinking attention spans, and about how basically Twitter is too long for people. It was never really meant to be anything, but in it, I kind of talked about, hey, stories this length, if we had to call it something, well, why not call it hint fiction? And we had a little contest that Sturdo Nam judged, and it caught the attention of Norton, who then kind of contacted me about putting together a collection. And so the anthology, hint fiction, the anthology of stories in 25 words or fewer, came out in November. It was actually reviewed pretty positively by places like The New Yorker, the LA Times. We were on NPR. The Nervous Breakdown shows us one of their favorite books of the year, which was extremely nice of them. I kind of honestly thought that there would be a lot more resistance to it, but happily there wasn't as much resistance. So we're going to then talk just very informally about different topic questions we have. Kind of get a sense. Roxane is kind of our house skeptic. She is in the, these are all contributors in the anthology, but we've had many talks about just very short fiction in general, like Twitter fiction or nanoism or whatever you want to call it. This panel is not meant to kind of shove the idea down your throat and saying you must, accept these as stories, but we do want to kind of create a dialogue saying, to make you think more about what a story is and, if length really matters. At the end, at the end, obviously, we're going to leave it up for questions. However, what I will do, since this is like the age of Twitter, if you do have Twitter and you want to tweet a question to hint_fiction, while we're doing this, maybe, while we're talking, something comes to you and, you don't want to interrupt us, which would just be rude. So go ahead and tweet it and do our best to try to incorporate it, okay? So again, that's hint_fiction. So, all right, let's begin here. When we started out with the anthology, it was very important that it just were not stories of 25 words or less. or fewer, I should say. The proper word is fewer. I wanted to make sure that these stories actually did something. You know, they were, you know, they just were not 25 words. And so I kind of came up with a thesis that a story of 25 words or fewer can be just as effective as a story of traditional length. And that's where a lot of resistance initially came in. I had an essay up at Daily Beast, which the working title was Participating in the Downfall of Literature, but they had changed it to Shorter is Better. Basically, one response from a established writer was, you know, thank you, but I prefer not to participate in the downfall of literature, because, you know, there is that view that Story to Shore and Twitter is basically going to just destroy literature. So, one of the epigrams in here is the E.M. Forster quote from Aspects of a Novel, which is "The king died and then the queen died" is a story. "The king died and then the queen died of grief" is a plot. So let's start then with just really what is a story. Daniel, let's start with you.
What is a story? First of all, Robert, thank you. This has been an exciting trip with you. What is a story? Well, maybe I'll answer by giving a little anecdote. I was having lunch, late lunch today, and I ran into a nice woman with a French accent who is an Egyptologist, and she is here for the first time at AWP. And so we had lunch, and we were talking about what we were doing. I talked about this pen and explained it, showed her the book. She thought it was beautiful. And then she asked me the question, what is the function of pen fiction? And I said, matter? No, I didn't say that. I said, well, what's the function of literature? And she looked at me and she smiled. And then I went on to say, look at poetry. We have many different types of titles or descriptions of what a poem could be. We have haiku, we have sonnets, we have very many different permutations of what poetry is. And we have probably many, many fewer permutations of what fiction can be called in terms of structure. We're familiar, of course, with short stories and various versions of short stories, the novel, of course, and subcategories. So what is a story? To me, a story creates an image of typically human endeavor or desire that may lead someplace. That's what I view story as being. That's at least the kind of story that interests me as a fiction writer. And I will read my piece in order to show what I mean.
Sure.
Because I think it fits with what I view, what the definition I just gave is. So my pen fiction's entitled Better Than Divorce. The bull terrier watched the car fishtail and then straightened as it sped away. The dog turned, looked down, and gently licked his master's forehead. So with that story, I try to talk about different things and hopefully hint at why did this man or woman kill this guy? And why is it better than divorce? And this poor dog, so loyal, right there by his master's dead body, not leaving. A lot of different desires, a lot of different endeavors in that story. And it's not meant to be snarky or nasty. It's just sometimes there's dark humor, I think, in human desire. So anyway, that's my little spiel for that.
All right. Randall, what do you think?
What Daniel said. This is probably a weird answer, but I was thinking of a quote that I read in the Rose Meadow Press Field Guide to Writing Flash Fiction, and it's by Rusty Barnes, who is the founder of Night Train. He said, somewhere between the linear narrative and the postmodern fracturing of narrative, there might be a third way, dependent on its brevity as its primary descriptor. And so I was thinking, I don't really understand what that means. But the fracturing that the fraction that came to mind is when my wife and I were writing our own vows. we researched what it meant to break the glass during the Jewish wedding. And it had something to do with being reminded of the fracturing of the world. The world is shattered and is no longer whole. And then we found this nice piece. Whoever would break this couple up has to first put this glass back together. And I've just been trying since. So I thought of the linear narrative would put the glass back together invisibly so that it's whole and appears as a glass. And the postmodern fracturing would put the glass, maybe it wouldn't even look like a glass, but it would put it back together, but you'd be aware that it was a glass that was put back together, and it would make the cracks visible, and you would be aware that it's a process that was putting a glass back together. And I thought brevity is that you take one shard of that glass and try to fill it with something. And so there is a sense both that it's whole, that it's written in this compressed tiny space, but at the same time it's broken, it's one shard of something else. And so one story that I've been thinking about is that when my wife and I got married and I stepped on the glass, I missed the glass and smashed her foot. I know. Yeah, exactly. So I was thinking if that kind of moment feels like a hint fiction piece to me, because it doesn't need any other story, that's the story. And it could stand for many things about the beginning of that marriage. And so, you know, when I'm not thinking, like before this panel, of how much Xanax do I need to get through it, or where are the exits, or those kinds of things, I was thinking about, you know, what would make that a story as opposed to this funny anecdote that we tell. And, you know, so I started thinking about the choices, that, like, what her reaction was. She had this, you know, you freaking asshole look that right away she wasn't, but it disappeared quickly. But I was thinking, like, what would make a good story, what would be a good reaction for her to have. And then I think, and I'm sure Michael can talk really well about this, nicely about this, but the title itself seems to be in these stories as a way to sort of, the title, you know, whatever you title that. And so my first inclination is often to, you know, like putting the right foot forward, and I think, boy, that's like a daily news kind of punny, stupid title. And so thinking of the right title to fit that story also. So to me, what makes it a story when I'm either reading it or writing it is that I start to think the way that someone writing a narrative or a story would think about the decisions they make. And when I read hint fiction and fiction that doesn't work, it seems like people are pretty satisfied with just the anecdote. Like it's like a funny story that you tell, but they aren't thinking about the other things and the other possibilities and getting the exact right word to describe what her description would be, or instead of going for the funny title or the pun title, a title that adds the entire subtext, which would be something that in 25 words you can't do, but a title can do that much more.